Hello students, we're going to look at Chapter 11, the endocrine system, with a little introduction here. We looked at the nervous system a couple of chapters ago and regulating the function of the human body to maintain homeostasis is an enormous job, so we need two organ systems to coordinate and enable the body parts to communicate with each other and to adjust constantly to changing incoming signals. And that's what the nervous system and endocrine system do. The endocrine system includes cells and tissues and organs that are collectively called endocrine glands, and they secrete substances called hormones into an internal environment. These hormones diffuse from the interstitial fluid into the bloodstream. In the endocrine system, because these glands are ductless, it dumps the hormones. Secreting cells dump the hormone directly into the fluid surrounding these cells, and this fluid will be picked up by the capillaries and delivered to target cells via the blood through the circulatory system. Now, the exocrine glands have ducts. Remember, we looked at exocrine glands when we looked at the skin. A sweat gland is a type of exocrine gland. It has tubes that lead to the outside of the body that delivers the substances secreted by these glands. Endocrine glands are ductless, so what happens is this chemical is released by these cells, hormone secreting cells, these endocrine cells, dumped into the interstitial fluid, or the fluid found in between these cells. It's picked up in these paper thin capillary walls, very, very, very thin walled capillaries that contain blood, and these hormones are picked up by the blood and carried to the target cells. Now, this is the thyroid gland. It is an endocrine gland, so again, it dumps its hormones directly into the fluid around those hormone secreting cells, and then the blood picks it up and takes it to the target cells. So these are microscopic cells surrounded by capillaries that pick up these chemicals that are sent to specific cells. Now, sometimes hormones are released in cells that are not in endocrine glands. So it's non-endocrine cells can release hormones like those released by the pancreas and the pancreatic islets here. These cells in the pancreas that produce two types of hormones that we'll talk about. This tissue secretes hormones, and hormones are chemical substances produced by one part of the body. It's carried by the blood around the body and causes certain cells called target cells to do something. So only these target cells are going to respond to these hormones that are carried in the blood. They will have receptors on these target cells that will pick up these hormones, these chemicals, and then this will cause something to happen. Target cells have protein receptors. Now, these receptors, it's almost like a lock and key mechanism. These receptors will only accept one type of chemical. That chemical will have one shape, and this receptor will have the corresponding shape, so they bond together where other substances would not bond to these particular proteins. So the receptors are they're custom made for particular chemicals or hormones, and the cell will respond, those target cells will respond from the type of chemical that is attached to it. The endocrine system interacts with the nervous system to regulate and coordinate body activities. Hormonal responses are usually slower or longer in duration. There's wider distribution than in nervous system control. Nervous system control are usually short-lived, where hormonal responses are usually longer lasting. Each gland generally secretes more than one type of hormone. The hormones circulate in the bloodstream in extremely small quantities, so small quantities can cause a lot of target cells to respond. So quantity is not that important as long as you have the cells with the correct receptors on the surface of the cell to receive those hormones, and that's what's important. Sometimes hormones are produced only temporarily. It's regulated by negative feedback, and we've talked about negative feedback before. Now let's compare the nervous system to the endocrine system. Now when we looked at the nervous system, here's that neuron with the nerve impulse going in this direction. Remember that these dendrites here receive incoming nerve impulse, and it sums in the axonal helix here, and then all those sodium ion gated the sodium ion channels open up, that nerve impulse travels along this axon, and when you get to the synaptic knob you have an influx of calcium. Remember that influx of calcium will cause that neurotransmitter to be released at the synapse, and that's a chemical that's going to cause something to happen. So after the synapse, postsynaptic cell responds to that neurotransmitter in either having something happen, or it's either excitatory or inhibitory. Now this is usually a short-term response. Now glandular cells secrete hormone into the bloodstream, and then the target cells with the hormone receptors respond to the hormone, and then other hormones that are in the blood may not affect or will not affect those cells that do not have the receptors. Okay, so this hormone is specific to this receptor, or this receptor is specific to this hormone. The other hormones in the blood do not affect these target cells if they do not have the correct receptors. So receptors are very important as whether or not that cell is going to respond to that chemical message. It only targets cells of the hormone responds. That's specific to that hormone, specific receptors to the specific hormone. Now there are two different types of hormones. There are steroids, and then there are amino acid derivatives, non-steroids. Now steroids is a type of lipid and an amino acid. Now we've only briefly talked about proteins, and proteins are made up of amino acids. So amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. They are non-steroid. They are water soluble. Steroids are lipid soluble. Amino acid derivatives are water soluble. Proteins these are from proteins, so it's broken down proteins into amino acids. Steroids are lipid based. Steroids are fat soluble. Okay, you know that fat will dissolve into fat. Fat does not dissolve in water. The cell membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. In other words, it has fat. So steroid hormones can go directly into a cell because it can pass through that phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. It has complex rings. It's synthesized from cholesterol. So we need a certain amount of cholesterol in our diet, and we make some cholesterol and then we take in some cholesterol in our diet. But lipids, steroids, are fat-soluble lipids that can go directly into a cell. It can pass through it without receptors. That's what's important here, is a steroid hormone can go into a cell. It does not need a receptor. Now, once it gets inside the cell, there will be receptors inside the cell that will take these hormones and cause the cells to do something. Now, steroid hormones can diffuse into cells relatively easily, so they can really go into any cell in your body, but those cells will not respond to that hormone unless they are the specific target cells. When the steroid hormone molecule enters the target cell, then again there are receptors inside of that target cell that will receive that hormone and bind to it. The resulting hormone receptor complex binds to the nucleus, to the specific sequence of the target cell's DNA. It activates transcription. In other words, it's going to activate the nucleus and direct it into making either more proteins or proteins for hormones, proteins for enzymes, or even more of the receptors, hormone receptors, to provide more hormone receptor complex binding with other cells, and that would be the response for that particular steroid hormone. So newly synthesized proteins may become enzymes or transport proteins, or even hormone receptors carry out specific effects associated with that particular steroid hormone. Now, amino acid derivative hormones. These are generally water soluble. So again, the phospholipid bilayer of a cell is made up of primarily lipid. So water is not soluble in lipids, so that hormone will not go into that cell. So you have to have receptors on that particular target cell in order for that a hormone to bind to that particular cell. Now, these amino acid derivatives, what is an amino acid? Amino acid is the building block of a protein. So its groups is amines, proteins, and peptides. Now, it's carried in the blood again. Amines are individual amino acids. Proteins are a long string of amino acids that are bound together. Those receptors on the surface of that membrane, that cell membrane, that receptor is going to be a particular type of protein. But anyway, it's a complete chain of these amino acids for a complete protein. Now, a peptide, you can have a dipeptide or a polypeptide. A dipeptide would be two amino acids, or two amines or amino acids. They form this amino acid bonds to this amino acid, and that bond in between is called a peptide bond. So a dipeptide would be two amino acids bonded together. Polypeptide, many amino acids, many amino acids bound together by peptide bonds, but it's an incomplete protein. So that's what a peptide is. So these hormones could be amines or complete protein, or some type of peptide. all transported by the blood, has to have that receptor on the target cell membrane to bind to the hormone to cause changes to happen. Now, steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble. They can go into the cell, and they have receptors inside that target cell which can be associated with the nuclear membrane, and it can cause gene activation. And these fat soluble can enter the cell without a receptor on the outside. The receptors are on the inside. So the function of these particular hormones, steroid hormones, is for gene activation: estrogen, progestin, and androgens. Estrogen, androgens are sex hormones. Okay, so what happens with these is usually gene activation. So with gene activation, you have the production of proteins, as we spoke of a few minutes ago. Okay, now enzyme activation for non-steroid hormones like epinephrine, insulin, dopamine. These are water soluble, so they require a receptor to enter the cell. So that receptor can activate an enzyme. That receptor could be a type of enzyme. The receptors are going to be proteins, and enzymes are proteins. And so you can have some enzyme activation in association with these non-steroid hormones. So that would be the hormonal action would be triggering enzymes. So with the steroid hormones, gene activation; with the non-steroid hormones, enzyme activation. There is a response in these cells in this way. And we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up with part 2, control of hormonal secretions.